A few pieces of housekeeping before we get into the lesson. One thing I'd like to mention is we announced that Noah Jones was going to be coming to speak to us this Wednesday night. It's actually going to be Jordan Alker. They swapped, so Jordan will be joining us on Wednesday night. As well as for our lock-in. I think next time we're just going to have a lockout. We're just going to not open the doors to all of them. No, we had a great time. If you missed it, you sure missed a lot of fun, and I'm grateful for everyone's participation within it. If you know anything about me, you know, and even if you don't, if you have eyes and you see me quite frequently, you know very quickly that I am a man of consistency. I wear the same outfit, not the same exact one. I do have a washer and dryer, and I do have multiple versions of this outfit. But I wear a black polo and khakis almost every day of the week, with the exception of today, on Sunday. And as far as consistency is concerned, I like consistency. I like things to be the same way. I like for things to carry with it a sense of trust. I know that if I eat the same thing, I'm going to enjoy my meal every time. I know that if I wear the same thing, I'm going to look good every time. I guess, I don't know. Won't always be humble about it, I guess, but you know. But I'm a man of consistency. And I appreciate when things don't change. From the time that I was very young, in fact, from the time that I was born, there have been things that have been a part of my life and a part of my relationship to God that seem to be a little hard to get away from. Things that I hold fast to that mean a whole lot to me throughout my life that upon further investigation, you know, I start to realize they might not be what they've always been cracked up to be. I am a kind of person that even for me to use PowerPoint is I just don't really like it. But some of y'all do, so we use PowerPoint. So it helps y'all keep notes for when my brain starts to go all crazy and go off a little bit. And I really don't like to use a prop or some kind of physical example or illustration. But today I found it necessary. Today I found it helpful to the point where I couldn't just ignore it. If you can't see from all the way in the back, you see before you what is commonly known as a Russian nesting doll or a nesting doll. And the original purpose of these Russian nesting dolls came about during the Industrial Revolution of Russia, as they began to manufacture things and toys. And this toy actually that was created with a great purpose. You see, these would be personalized from time to time to structured to look like your family. And so you would have different generations with the baby or the youngest of the family to be represented by the smallest of the nesting dolls. And this baby would be placed with the inside of the generations that were coming before it. And the main purpose behind it was to show this mindset of a constant progression. That with each generation, the success or the well-being of that family would grow and grow and grow, and would further get away from poverty or further get away from a sense of falling apart and get more towards a structured mindset. And this Industrial Revolution helped to create within the minds of the Russian economy or in the Russian people this sense of confidence within themselves and within their government. That as each generation were to come, that they would progress further and further, an increase in their knowledge and in their skill and in their ability. And this morning we're going to talk a little bit about these, but I want them to just sit here for a while, and we'll get back to them. You see, like I said, I'm a man of consistency. I've done things the same way for just about my whole life. Khakis aren't a new thing to Case. In fact, my high school nickname was Khaki Case. That's how people knew me. They did not know my last name. They didn't know my parents. They didn't know a sport that I played. They knew me as the kid who showed up to high school wearing khakis. All right? I like to do things the same way. But sometimes consistency does not always mean that I'm doing something right. You see, to be consistently wrong or to do something consistently wrong results in a furthering from success or a furthering from truth. The very thing that these Russian nesting dolls spoke out against. They wanted for things to progressively go right, for the right decisions to be made, to the hard work to be put into it, so that the generations could benefit from it and grow stronger. something that scares me is that some of the things that we have held fast to and placed as essential within our lives have become hurtful rather than helpful. And so this morning I found it fitting for us to talk about traditions of men. And as we look through this, I want us to be strengthened and encouraged, knowing that there are some things that might need to change, but there are some things that help to build us up and make us to be stronger individuals. You see, in the writings of Paul, both to the church at Thessalonica, my clicker's not working, both to the church at Thessalonica, clicker's still not working, I don't know what's going on. Oh, there we go. Both to the church at Thessalonica and to the church at Corinth, Paul writes of a certain mindset. In fact, he encourages both of these parties to hold fast to the traditions that have been set before you. Let's look at 2 Thessalonians 2, beginning with verse 13 very quickly. He says, "But we ought to always give thanks to God for you, brothers beloved by the Lord, because God chose you as a first fruits, or the first fruits, to be saved, through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth. To this He called you through our gospel, so that you may obtain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter. Now may our Lord Jesus Christ Himself and God our Father, who loved us and gave us eternal comfort and good hope through grace, comfort your hearts and establish them to every good work and word." You see, when we look at the writings here in 2 Thessalonians, and I also encourage you to flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul makes mention of these holding fast to these traditions. Now, the problem lies is when we forget what these traditions were. If you'll remember, he makes reference to the letters that had been written, or the words that had been spoken to the church both at Thessalonica and to all the other churches that Paul spoke to in his writings. And one of the things that he makes mention of is taking the gospel of Christ and making it a part of our life, so much so that it becomes who we are. It becomes so consistent that it becomes our character. So these traditions that we see are not what we would commonly think of as traditions. And we're going to address a little bit about this in 1 Corinthians 11. But he makes mention of these things that we probably wouldn't consider to be traditions. But really what we would and should consider these things to be is teachings about the Messiah. Teachings about Jesus and His actions. And he's saying, take the things that we have taught you about Jesus, about His love, about His mercy, about His forgiveness, about the care for those who are in need and those who are sick and those who are filled with grief or pain or suffering. And you show to them the love of God, and that is their tradition. To practice the teachings of Jesus so much so that it becomes their character. It becomes who they are. So when Paul says to hold fast to the traditions that have been set before you, he's not talking about what we would commonly consider to be traditions. He's saying, hold fast to the teachings that I have set before you and make them to be a characteristic within your life. These traditions are love. These traditions are mercy. These traditions are forgiveness or kindness or faithfulness. These traditions are the things that Jesus came to teach, and that Paul and Peter and Timothy and the rest of the disciples and the apostles were teaching in the first century. Be like Jesus. That's the traditions that they're to hold fast to. And you might say, okay, so then what about 1 Corinthians 11? What do we talk about then when it begins to talk about something that was bothering the church at Corinth? He begins in verse 1 by saying, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. We made mention of this when I first got here. This is our theme for the year, to look to the teachings of Paul, to be strengthened and encouraged by them, and to follow after him in the footsteps of following after Jesus. And so he begins to talk about this idea of head coverings. And he makes mention in verse 2, now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain, notice this, maintain or hold fast the traditions even as I have delivered them unto you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. I want you to pause for just a moment. I would like for you to look to your left. This is my left, so I'm going to look this way. You aren't doing it. Look to your left and look to your right. How many women do you see with head coverings on? How many men do you see with head coverings on? How many women do you see with long hair? How many men do you see with long hair? How many women do you see with short hair? How many men do you see with short hair? Well, it's obviously not applying to us, right? I mean, it's not talking about us, because we don't have this problem. This isn't a division, and that's Paul's statement here. Paul is not saying that this is a tradition that they have to hold fast to, that we're to always have head coverings on. But as far as the culture is concerned, during that time it was a dishonor not just to the woman, but also to her family, to her father, to her husband, to the church, for them not to have a head covering on. Why? Well, it would have been today's modern version of maybe wearing a scarlet letter upon their chest. This very dishonorable profession would commonly shave their heads. And so he's saying, separate yourselves from this kind of thing. And so you see Paul making mention of these traditions just before making mention of head coverings. And you see him also talking to the church at Thessalonica, making mention of traditions and referencing, of course, these traditions that he has taught them of love and of care and of concern. And so we look at traditions and go, okay, well, Paul told us to hold fast to these traditions. And we can do a great job of doing that with love and mercy and kindness, but where are our head coverings? Well, Paul's traditions that he's talking about holding fast to is not a physical object that's placed upon your head. Paul's idea that he is trying to introduce to the church here at Corinth is a position of honor, a position of lifting up the name of God. And so the tradition that they are to hold fast to is not the tradition for them it was the tradition of wearing a head covering. But it was for cultural reasons. It was so that honor would be brought forward towards the church, rather than dishonor being brought towards the church and towards the family. And so we look at traditions. Traditions are not this evil, wicked, bad thing. In fact, Paul encourages two churches, at least, to hold fast to traditions. But we have to remember that the traditions that he is talking about is bringing honor not just to God, but to the church and to your family, to your spouse. It's showing love and care and concern to those who are in need. These traditions are not what we would consider as common traditions. So when the Bible speaks about traditions, sometimes the phrases that are used here are good things. Sometimes the Bible talks about traditions as being good things. But there was a man by the name of Jesus. And while he was on this earth, he talked about this very same topic. And he did so not in a way that contradicts the teachings of Paul, because the teachings of Paul were inspired, meaning they were from God. So it doesn't contradict each other. But Jesus begins to say some things that don't necessarily add up sometimes. Because see, Paul talks about holding fast to these traditions, and yet in multiple places, Jesus begins to make mention of these things as being dangerous or evil or wicked at times. Things that separate maybe us from God. And so we begin to look at passages like Colossians chapter 2, and I'd encourage you to open up to Colossians chapter 2 if you will. You begin to look at some of the teachings in Colossians, and once again, this is not Jesus himself, but this is Paul's ministry to the church, and he begins to make mention in verse 6. He says, "Therefore, as you receive Christ the Lord, so walk in Him, rooted and built up and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human traditions, according to the elements elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in Him the whole fullness of the deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in Him, who is the head of and rule of authority. In Him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, but by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with Him in baptism, in which you were also raised with Him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised Him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the circumcision of your flesh, God has made alive together with Him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This He set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and the authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in Him. We look at the teachings of Colossians chapter 2. He makes mention of this idea of being alive in Christ. And he does so by saying that being alive in Christ means that you have been set free from other things in this world. Included in that list, as you can read there in verse 8 if I'm not mistaken. Yes, in verse 8. Included within those things that you can be set free from are the traditions of this world, or human traditions. And so Paul, in writing about this idea, or writing about this mindset of finding yourself being free within Christ, rising to walk in newness of life, this new spirit separated from that old man of sin, but also separated from the bonds or the chains that have been placed upon you by man. He says that the things that have been placed upon them, the things that have been pressured upon them and pressed down as if a thumb was pressing down upon an ant, these things you have been set free from. Why? Because of the cross. Because He nailed them to the cross and brought something that is far better. Brought a sacrifice that cleanses us not just from the sin of the world, but also from the trials and the tribulations of the world, and sets us free from the captivity of sin and what comes within this world. And so we look and go, okay, Paul teaches about holding fast to traditions, but these traditions were traditions or what we would consider practices that became who we are in reflecting Jesus. And then he writes to the church at Colossae and says that you are now made free within Christ, and included within that are setting yourself free from the traditions of men. And then we look to passages like Matthew chapter 15. And we look as John read for us in verses 1 through 3, he begins to talk about these traditions and this problem that the Pharisees were having with Jesus. And the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, so they began to have a problem with him. As we see in verse 1, they came to him they came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." And he answered them, "And why do you break the commandments of God? For the sake of your tradition. For God commanded, honor your father and your mother. Whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what would you have gained from this? From me is given to God. He need not honor his father for the sake of your tradition. You have made void the word of God. You hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." You see, when Jesus begins to talk about these traditions, he begins to create a great sense of worry within the Pharisees. And one of the things that he makes mention of, after they challenged him about not having his disciples not wash their hands before eating, he begins to challenge them on their traditions. He says, why have you placed so many traditions that you have forgotten to follow after the commandments of God? You have held so highly the commandments of man that you have forgotten to follow after the commandments of God. And this is not the only time that he talks about this. He actually talks about this same account here in Mark chapter 7 verses 1 through 13, another recording of this account. And he adds to this a little bit in his response. He says, what did the prophet Isaiah say? You hypocrites, as it is written, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold fast to the traditions of men. He said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. Whoever reviles father and mother must surely die. But you say, If man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is, to be given unto God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, thus making the void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many, notice this, and many such things you do. The Pharisees and the scribes were actively speaking out against Jesus and his disciples for not following after their traditions. And he says, here's your problem. Your traditions have started to be in complete contrast of the teachings and commandments of God. And so instead of him being rebuked by the Pharisees and the scribes, he's rebuking the Pharisees and scribes and saying, listen, these traditions, you have made them to be gospel. You have made them to be the law. And in doing so, you have ignored or made in vain the commandments of God. And so what is his response? In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine. Notice that, teaching for doctrine, teaching as the law. The commandments are the traditions of men. So when we look at some of the dangers involved within traditions, we look at how Jesus speaks out against not just traditions within themselves, but the problems that arise when certain traditions come in between you and God. The problem arises when the thing that you have created, not God, the thing that you have created has become the truth, has become doctrine, has become the gospel. And in doing so, what you're doing is you're taking away from the Word of God, making it vain. And so he says to them, your worship has become to me as vain. Why? Because you have made your law doctrine. You have made your law gospel. And in doing so, you have separated yourself from me. One more passage I would like for us to look at, and then we'll move on to a couple other things, is Matthew chapter 23. We'll begin verses 1 through 12. I'll be honest, I forgot to start my stopwatch. I have no idea how long I've been up here, so we'll just say I've been up here 5 minutes, so I got 40 to go. Tough crowd today. Got a little tense yet? Wait. Just wait. Beginning in verse 1. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit on Moses' seat. So do they observe whatever they tell you. But not the works they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their own finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, but you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The writings here in Matthew chapter 23 are coupled, especially with this talk about traditions, are coupled between a series of woe unto yous, a series of speaking out against some of the things that had become common practice for the Pharisees. And in and amongst these woes being pronounced, he pronounces woe on these things that have been placed upon the people of God. And he talks about the way that the rulers have handled these things. He said, you've placed this great amount of burden, this great amount of pressure upon these people, and yet you yourselves aren't willing to lift a finger. And you've created all these extra problems and all these struggles and all this pain and this suffering that these people are to endure and to fight through, and yet you yourself are doing nothing. And he says, you sit on the throne of Moses, or you sit in the seat of Moses, and yet your heart is completely empty. You worship with your lips, you lift God's name on high, you exalt God, you pronounce exhortation upon the Father, and yet you yourself are lost within your heart. And then when you walk into the synagogues and into the temples, when you walk in and amongst the people, you make broad your phylacteries, which is a phenomenal way of saying you get all dressed up and look good and look the part, and yet you do nothing. And when you're at the feast, you sit yourself at the heads of the tables and you make yourself to be prominent, and yet you yourself need to be humbled because you do nothing. You call yourselves rabbis, you call yourselves teachers, you call yourselves instructors, you call yourselves all kinds of things that exalt yourself, and yet you yourselves need to be in submission. And He gives a warning. He says, humble yourselves or you yourself will be humbled. Jesus isn't beating around the bush, if you can't tell. He's getting straight to the point. He's saying, you have taken what God has given you. You have been shown the ways in which God can come in contact with God. And what you've done is you've clouded it. You've placed more things upon it, and you've made it harder and harder to see. And in doing so, you've made it almost impossible for somebody to be a true follower of God because of all these traditions that you have placed upon it. And what you yourselves are doing is you're realizing that you are empty. You've exalted yourself when really you're nothing. You have made yourself to be high and mighty when really the greatest among you is the one who submits and humbles himself and is a servant. Jesus is trying to get them to open their eyes and realize you have done it all wrong. You have taken the beautiful thing that God has given you and you've changed it. And you've lost your sense of what it's supposed to be. You've lost the vision of what He created for it to be. You look at the laws involved with making sacrifice. And you look at the multiplication of those laws because of tradition. You look at the way in which God and man could exist and be together in each other's presence. And then you look at all the traditions that are piled on by the leaders, and you begin to realize we have separated ourselves so far that we have made it ourselves impossible to reach God. And you might be thinking, whoo, you know what? I'm glad that's the Pharisees and the scribes and not us. I'm glad that's them. I'm glad they're the ones placing measures that can't be met. I'm glad that they're the ones who are putting pressure upon each other to meet these goals and these expectations that are unreachable. So I want us to think about a few things this morning. Oh man, I still got plenty of time. I want us to think about a few of these things. I want us to open our eyes and be honest with ourselves. And before I move this next slide, I want to start out by saying I love you. Good morning. I want us to realize that these things aren't inherently bad. These things aren't evil or wicked. But the intentions of the Jews when they began to place these things, these traditions, weren't either. By the time that Jesus came to this earth, it had become impossible to be a servant of God. And so He spoke out against things that kept people from being perfect or kept people from being able to reach God. And that's what we're going to do this morning. These things aren't bad, like I said. But if we treat them the wrong way, if we make them to be gospel, and we might be in need of the same kind of speech that He gave those Pharisees and the scribes. The same speech that included phrases like, you brood of vipers, you hypocrites. So we need to be careful of that. Let's look at some of these this morning. Y'all don't read? I'll get to it. Y'all don't read? No, I'm just kidding. Pews. We're sitting in now, nice and comfy, right? All right, those weren't brought in until the Protestant Reformation. What they replaced was, guess what? Tables. They replaced tables. They replaced things that were gathered around. Now, some of the early churches began to use some things similar of this, but when you look back at Acts chapter 2 and you begin to see the establishment of the church, you begin to see that there was this idea of communing, this idea of being together. And during the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, what we began to see is this idea of making things to be decent and in order, making things to be structured. And so instead of looking each other in the eyes, you're looking at the head in front of you, the bald spot or little gray hairs popping up. You're not looking at each other and making connections. The way that I'm not so sure that I'm glad to make right now as I get some stares. You're looking at the back of each other's heads. What about pulpits? Oh, this one's a real fun one. Pulpits didn't come around until the 300s, and when they did, they were placed off to the side And the Lord's Supper table was placed upon a pedestal, or was placed on an exalted way. And then during the Protestant Reformation, these pulpits came from being off the side and were placed on the prominent selection, moving these tables, this place of reverence, this place of communing, this place of gathering together with God, down. And in so doing, we exalted the preachers. We exalted those who delivered the message of God. And then what you begin to see, because of things like these pulpits being exalted, you begin to see these systems where churches are led by one person who makes all the decisions. Or you begin to see these things where the person is held to higher standards, or is given too much glory, or is given too much. Why? Because we literally exalted the position and placed them above everybody else. Buildings mostly began around the 300s as a place of, as the church began to outgrow the homes a little bit, they began to meet in bigger meeting places. They began to, of course, still meet in secret due to persecution, but they began to have these places where it was removed from the home. It was no longer such and such as home that we gather together in on Sunday. It was a local community. And if you'll remember, this is not a new idea. In fact, this is an established idea. The temple was built as a place where God and man could come together, a place where they could be located together and come in contact with God. And yet, when Jesus came to this earth, what was one of the main things that He preached against? Oh, my voice went out on me a little bit there. Don't laugh, Amanda. He began to preach against their view of the temple. They began to see this building covered in gold, and they thought about how beautiful and amazing and fantastic it was. And they forgot why they were there in the first place. They remembered that it was a beautiful building, but they forgot that that's where they came in contact with God. And so they started putting more reverence on the building than they did on worshiping God. What about suits? This is a fun one. Y'all, I'll be honest with you, I thought about preaching in my khakis and my black polo this morning, but I didn't want to be too controversial for y'all. Suits didn't come around to the 18th and 19th century. You want to know why suits were brought in? To separate classes. It was a way of showing that you were better than someone else. Seems like we just read Matthew chapter 23 about a group of people making broad their phylacteries and exalting themselves. They were literally brought in as a way to show that I am better than you. James writes about this in James chapter 2. He begins to talk about the one who comes in lavish apparel. And what do? We welcome them to the front. And yet the one who comes in rags, yes, we bring them up front, but we make them to be the footstool of the one who comes in lavish apparel. In his writings, he's talking about not showing too much honor to somebody, but treating all men equally as God has created them. And so what we did in the 18th and 19th century is we took things into our own hands and we started letting the rich show up in suits so that they could be better and so that everyone could notice that they were better. What about second services? This didn't begin until World War II. On a Sunday afternoon or Sunday night, get together because of shift work. As it became more prevalent, so did second services. Wednesday night's a little bit controversial as well. Once again, came around in the Protestant Reformation. Do you know why Wednesday nights began in the Protestant Reformation? They were actually prayer services. And what they were doing is they were pleading with those who had stopped coming every day and gathering together and communing every day with the church. They were pleading with them to just give them one more moment to be together as the church. And so it was literally a compromise as a way of bringing the congregation together. Well, they stopped coming every day. We can't get them to come and meet house to house every day. We can't get them to commune. So what do? Let's just get them to agree to one more service on a Wednesday night. What about Sunday school? Once again, this was brought in during the Protestant Reformation as a way of educating the children, which is a great thing. Fully stand behind it, fully support it. But yet at the same time, where's the problem in all these things? I mean, hey, is there anything wrong with pews? No. Y'all are sitting in them. I sat in them. They're comfy. What about pulpits? Hey, it's great for me to have a place to sit my stuff down. That's fantastic. What about buildings? It's comfortable. We mentioned it this morning in the giving. We're blessed to have somewhere where we can commune together. Suits, second services, Wednesday night, Sunday school, all these things are not bad things. But remember what Jesus said to the Jews. Remember the message that He delivered. He says, the problem lies when you take these things that you have created and you make them to be the message of God. and you judge and you determine, or you begin to wonder and gauge, that's the word I was looking for. You begin to gauge someone's faithfulness, not by how they reflect Jesus, but by how they meet the traditions that have been set before them. Pews replaced tables. Pulpits exalted those who were to be humble. Buildings became the modern place, and in so doing created billions of dollars that were going to a building rather than to the work of the Lord. Only to be used about 4 hours a week on average. We didn't spend billions of dollars on this one, by the way, just in total. Billions of dollars in total. Suits were literally brought in as a way of separating the classes, not humbling each other, but exalting yourself. Second services met daily in the church. The early church met daily, house to house, not just 1 or 2 times a week. Same thing goes for Wednesday nights. The solution for meeting every day was a compromise. Let's just at least let them meet on Wednesday nights as well. Sunday school is an addition, not a command. And you look at these things and go, okay, Case, it was already a little warm in here. Now it's getting awkward. Now nobody's smiling. Now, thank you, Amanda. I needed that. Now nobody's comfortable. Why? Because we're talking about these things that we hold to be so special to us. We've talked about these things that have been a part of our lives forever. And they're fine. That's okay. The problem lies when these things become gospel, when they become doctrine, when they become the way in which you gauge someone's faithfulness. I made mention at the beginning of the lesson that these nesting dolls were originally created as a representation of generations. And in so doing, you would want to get better and better as it got smaller. You're preparing the way for those who were to come after you. But I want to be encouraged to look at something a little bit differently. See, this is the smallest piece. It's a little bit bigger than the eraser on a pencil. It's really hard to see, so I'm going to describe it to you a little bit better. It is almost brown, how red it is. It is completely covered. And I want us to imagine, if you will, that this represents the early church. Small, but completely covered in the blood of Christ. You can't help but see Jesus here. But time goes on. A few hundred years pass. Go add a little tradition in. Just one. Nothing too much. Still red. Still dark red, in fact. And it's bigger. Church is growing. That's great. Another 100 years, another tradition. Another 100 years, another tradition. Once again, hey, it's getting a little less red. But that's all right. That's all right. Another tradition. If y'all can't tell, my hands are shaking because I'm nervous. Another tradition. Comes another one. Over time, the church grew. That's great. It's fantastic. That's what it was designed to do. But it was also designed to reflect Jesus. And as Jesus was speaking to those Pharisees and those scribes, He warned them about something. He warned them about their traditions becoming so special that they forgot why they were created. They forgot why the laws were established. You see, you go back to that first century church, you go back to that tiniest little piece inside these nesting dolls, and you see a small group of people that is completely covered by the blood, and you go to today. You might make the argument, it's red. I mean, it's a little pink, but it's red. But you know what, man? It's bigger. And look how much the church has grown. Thousands a day were being added to the Lord's church after the day of Pentecost, after the teaching of the gospel. And now we've gotten to a point where there's millions and even maybe billions of people who want to follow after the message of Jesus, who want to follow after the teachings of Christ. And so we justify these things and say, you know what? It's still kind of red, but it's bigger, so it must be better. What we have done with these traditions is we've still reflected Jesus. As we gather and even as we practice these things, we still show Jesus. but these things cloud our minds. Deep down within this doll, under and amongst all those traditions, is a church that loves God, that loves its neighbor, and that practices that love in everything that it does. The same way that we do. The same way that we love God, and the same way that we love each other and practice the things that we've been taught. But, you know what you can't see right now? That church. That blood-covered spot. Why? A whole bunch of traditions stacked on it. You see, when we welcome somebody to Jesus, they want to see Jesus. They want to discover that way. They want to follow after His teachings. They want to do what's right in the sight of God. But in order for them to see Jesus, they got to see past a couple things. They see a group of people maybe that wear their Sunday best, and you don't fit in unless you do. They see a group of people who don't gather around tables or gather daily, but gather in pews twice a week. They see a group of people who love God and who love their neighbor and want to do right by him and by them, and yet their struggle is to continue to show Jesus the same way. So what's our solution to this problem? How do we fix it? How do we solve the literal 1,000-year, 2,000-year problem that exists of these traditions? Well, it's simple. We remember what our purpose is. We take out those things that separate us from God, and we remember that at the surface, or at the middle of our lives, has and always should be Jesus. When the church began to the church today, the message has always remained the same. That God loves you, that God cares for you, that He wants to be with you for eternity. And so He placed us as the church upon this earth to show that love and that care and that concern. One thing that I want us to remember is that the more and more that we stack these things together, the more traditions that we hold as gospel or place too much importance on, the harder it is for people to see the church. Even if it might look like things are better. If you've forgotten what your purpose is, if you've forgotten where your mindset should be, well, maybe we've become like those Pharisees and those scribes who teach for doctrine the commandments of men and offer up to God vain worship. I'm not saying these things have to be removed. I'm not saying let's sell the building and burn it down and take out the pews and only wear, tennis shoes and shorts to services. What I'm saying is let's make sure that we don't get so clouded by the things that we have placed on the church that we forget that our purpose here upon this earth is to serve God, to love God, to serve each other, and to love each other. I want to leave you with just a few more thoughts. The problem is that we gauge faithfulness, or when we gauge faithfulness to God, by seeing how committed we are to traditions. Rather than showing Jesus, we become the very thing that Jesus spoke against when He pronounced judgment upon the Jews. The Jews had placed such heavy emphasis on keeping of the law that they lost track of what the law was meant to do, which was to save. When we look at the root of all that we are supposed to be, what we will see is a group of believers in Jesus who seek to bring justice, peace, love, forgiveness, and mercy. However, when we add in all these extra things, we no longer focus as much on our main goal as Christians, and we make ourselves to be the judge. See Matthew 7, 1-6. When others look at us in order to find their ways to Jesus, what all do they have to move out of the way in order to find Jesus? How do we fix it? We change our priorities as servants of Jesus and focus on loving one another rather than making sure that we are following after the traditions of men. We are sent here to be image bearers. So let's do our part in reflecting Jesus so that God ultimately can receive the glory. See Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. Never forget that our job as Christians is to always show Jesus in everything that we do. Our love and our care for each other are always motivated by our love and care for Jesus. When we invite others to be with us and to join us in our relationship and in our walk with God, Don't make them fight their way through traditions to see Jesus. Let them see Jesus. Don't make them feel uncomfortable because they don't look, sound, or think exactly like you. Let them see Jesus. We talk about the thousands of reasons maybe why the church doesn't grow today the way that it used to. The way that it did in the first century. Or maybe even the way that it did in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Maybe it's because we've forgotten what we're here to do. Maybe we've been reflecting our commandments more than we've been reflecting God's. Maybe we've been showing our own image and making broad our phylacteries and exalting ourselves on high, that we've forgotten that our focus and our mindset should and has always been on Jesus. If you're here this morning and maybe something has come between you and the Lord and you're reflecting it more than you're reflecting God. When others see you, they're not looking at traditions, they're looking at sin. They're looking at something that doesn't allow for them to see Jesus. Jesus offers a solution. Cleanse yourself. Set yourself free the way that Paul spoke to the church at Colossae. Set yourself free from this sin, free from these burdens, and rise to walk as a new creation in Jesus, living fully and reflecting His love, care, and concern. Or maybe you've done that. You've accepted Jesus as your Savior and put Him on in baptism. You've followed Him, you've reflected Him, but the mirror's starting to get a little fuzzy. You started to stray away a little bit and you've forgotten deep down what you're supposed to be doing. Come back to God. Make yourself right with Christ. If you're here this morning, you need to be added to the Lord's church through baptism, or need to be accepted back home because of a failing to follow after the commandments of God, not of man, but of God. Please make that correction within your life. Let us pray for you, strengthen and encourage you together as we stand and as we sing.